Where were you? What were you doing when you realized that the US had lost its global dominance to China?
I was on the train on the Metro North commuting between New York City and New Haven, Connecticut. One day I came across this timetable from 1914. I found that the trains over 100 years ago were faster than they were in 2023. Now, it's not totally a apples to apples comparison because the trains make many more stops today than in the past. But still, something's going really badly off track when we're not building trains that are faster than 100 years ago. What's going on?
This week on Bold Names, Dan Wang. He is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's also the author of a new book. It's called Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. That's why I invited him on to talk about the competition between the US and China.
And Mims, you went solo this week because I was off. But before I went, you were so excited about getting him on because of all the stuff in his book, the stuff you learned, and also some of the provocative kind of arguments that he's making.
Yeah, Dan Wang is very opinionated, but he also brings receipts because he lived in China from 2017 all the way until 2023, where he was a tech analyst. Dan also has a surprising way of framing the key differences between the US and China. He says China can be understood as an engineering state. The US, on the other hand, is a lawyerly society. The idea is that in the US, we have a lot of rules and regulations. They're managed, in Dan's view, mostly by a class of lawyers. That's good in a lot of ways, though. Lawyers protect people's rights. That includes things like access to a clean environment, also the rule of law, and property protections. If you don't agree with something in the US, you have a voice. You can dissent. But Dan says that having all these lawyers around also means a lot of rules and procedures. Those can slow the US down. Like building things. Think of infrastructure projects, or housing, or manufacturing. Now, contrast that with China. Dan says that China is run mostly by engineers, and they like to build stuff. Think of enormous bridges, highways, or in their case, a manufacturing base that's the envy of the world. But China, of course, is a one-party system. People don't often have a say in any of this. They don't have a lot of rights necessarily, and the state has the power to build anything it wants. Dan and I talk about how China's efforts to engineer the environment have become social engineering through the country's one-child policy and, of course, its zero-COVID policy. I think this distinction between the US and China is important to keep in mind as you listen to and watch this interview. Dan here talks us through some of the very big challenges that both superpowers are facing now.
Yeah, and Dan was in China at a time that was both interesting politically and geopolitically, right? Chinese leader Xi Jinping was consolidating his domestic hold on China, getting that third term, and also looking outside of the borders, trying to develop even closer relationships with perceived U.S. rivals Russia and North Korea.
Right, and obviously things have just gotten more tense between the U.S. and China since then. Meanwhile, China's having some economic issues of its own, slowing growth. There could hardly be a more timely guest.
Oh, absolutely. This is a good one.
So let's take a big step back. And, why are we talking about China and the US at all, right? They're the two biggest economies in the world. They're the number 1 and 2 manufacturers. And you frame it in a way that I think is very useful. And so could you lay out for me kind of what is it, when you really boil it down, that the US is versus what China is when we're just trying to give people a shorthand?
So the central thesis of Breakneck is that China's a country I call the engineering state, because at various points, the entirety of China's most senior leadership, all 9 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and that
Politburo effectively controls the whole country.
That's right. It was the highest ruling echelon within the Communist Party. And so these were people trained as thermal engineers or electrical engineers or mechanical engineers. And what is it that engineers like to do? Well, they build. They kind of treat building another mega project as the solution to all of their problems. I contrast the engineering state with the United States, which I call the lawyerly society. The issue with lawyers is that they block absolutely everything. And I sort of came up with this framework in part to move away from these 20th century political science terms like capitalist or socialist or autocratic or neoliberal, whatever that means, to try to reason through the tensions between the US and China at the moment. It's kind of my simple shorthand for just thinking about what explains the pathologies of these two big superpowers.
Yeah, I love that both of these characterizations fly in the face of sort of the cartoonish, for somebody like me, raised on like 80s films where it's like the American hero versus the communist villain. Like the lawyerly society is not really a Rambo-like figure. And the engineering state, where you actually have a pretty light social safety net and everything is geared toward really giant corporations, that's not very conventionally communist. And I just highlight that because I feel like yours is a truer framing, and it really kind of, baked my noodle in terms of thinking differently about how each of these countries function. I think it'll really help our listeners if you can give a concrete example. Let's start with China. Let's start with the engineering state. But let's start with something that's very familiar. Most people are going to have one sitting in their pocket. China is where still most of the components for the iPhone are made, and made on a scale that's kind of incomprehensible in all of history. What is it about the engineering state, which has made, ironically, this iconic American company, Apple, possible?
Shenzhen is one of these legendary Chinese cities that substantially liberalized. It built at breakneck speed. Tim Cook and Steve Jobs decided that Shenzhen was going to be the site of most iPhone production. It was kind of a natural choice because Foxconn had already been building a lot of iPods in Shenzhen at that time.
Right, and Foxconn being Apple's number one contract manufacturer.
The biggest contract manufacturer in the world, that is this big Taiwanese company that other electronics makers contract to organize their workforces to produce their PCs or game consoles or iPhones. And after iPhone started rolling off the assembly lines, Shenzhen is just now the undisputed hardware capital of the world. And so Shenzhen is now the headquarters of companies like DJI. It is the headquarters of Tencent, one of China's most innovative internet platforms. It is just building a lot of stuff. And one of the things I point out in my book is that, if you want to figure out what Detroit was like in its heyday of production, I wouldn't go to Detroit today. I would go to Shenzhen to see historic Detroit. And so Shenzhen is the site where you had this giant manufacturing workforce rubbing shoulders with investors, being the site of a lot of universities as well. And so this is kind of the magic of China's manufacturing ecosystem, where you just had so many ingredients in place to produce innovative devices at great scale.
And let's talk about the lawyerly society. This example is almost like a hoary old chestnut at this point. But if people don't know it, we should talk about it. And that is California's failure to build high-speed rail, and how that contrasts with the fact that China now has more high-speed rail than every other country on Earth combined. How does California's inability to build high-speed rail exemplify the lawyerly society?
I go back to 2008, which was a pretty important year for high-speed rail in both the US and China. So in 2008, the voters in California approved a referendum to build a high-speed rail line between San Francisco in the north and Los Angeles in the south. In 2008, China began construction of its major, most profitable high-speed rail line connecting Beijing and Shanghai. So 3 years later, China actually completed the Beijing to Shanghai high-speed rail system. And over the first decade of its operation, this rail moved about 1.3 billion passenger trips. What has happened in California since 2008? Well, here we are in 2025. They've really reduced their ambitions such that segment 1 is supposed to connect only Bakersfield and Merced. It is slated to open this first segment somewhere around 2030 to 2033. That's the official estimate from the California state government. maybe we will have high-speed rail 20 years after California first approved this big referendum. But the Chinese were able to do this in 3 years, and they're just going to move billions more people, billions more passenger trips than whatever California is able to accomplish.
You had this great line in your book. You said the U.S. manufacturing base has rusted from top to bottom. And, you know, to read that as somebody who writes so much about manufacturing in the U.S., I was just like, ouch. What did you mean?
I meant that if you take a look at America's apex manufacturers, who is still making a lot of products, manufactured products today, I would point to Intel, the semiconductor maker. I would point to Boeing, the aviation maker. I would point to the automotive sector, which consists of Detroit automakers plus Tesla. And if you take a look at these apex manufacturers, almost always the headlines, including from the Wall Street Journal, are a tale of woe about these big manufacturers. Intel has been slipping extensively. Mostly what we hear are its layoffs and how it is not meeting quality production targets. Boeing has also had a lot of safety failures. That's very well covered. Detroit's has been falling for decades now. For a while, Tesla was kind of the bright spot in American manufacturing, but that's pretty uncertain now, given how erratic Elon Musk has been over the last couple of years. If you take a look at just the broader data of American manufacturing output fell pretty substantially since 2008. It's never really recovered. The US has lost about 1 million manufacturing workers since about 2008. And if you take a look at some of these more simple, basic products, the US simply hasn't covered itself in glory. At the start of the pandemic, when its manufacturers had a really hard time shipping products that were relatively simple, like masks and cotton swabs, we had shortages of all of these goods at the start of the pandemic in 2020. And if you take a look at some pretty critical military goods, something like munitions, Ukraine has drawn down a lot of American stocks in its defense against Russia, but the US hasn't really been able to get munition shells restarted either. And so I think that the US has rusted from top to bottom. Maybe there's still some successes out there in something like semiconductor production equipment. I'm sure we can find some bright spots here and there. But for the most part, the US hasn't been doing all that well.
Why does this matter? And when I say that, China for a long time, before its pivot to, I think in the book, what you call hard tech and infrastructure, was pursuing this US model of who cares where things are made. We'll control the intellectual property. It's manufactured in Shenzhen, but it's designed by Apple and Cupertino. All NVIDIA controls all of its IP and has all the know-how and the critical software and designs, which are then, of course, manufactured by TSMC and others, TSMC in Taiwan specifically. Why does it matter that it's rusted from top to bottom? Isn't this the goal? Aren't we trying to dematerialize our entire economy?
Maybe it doesn't matter so much. So if we take a look at stock valuations, it is certainly pretty remarkable that American tech companies hold up so much of stock market growth. It is pretty remarkable that there are multi-trillion-dollar companies, namely especially NVIDIA out there making all of the AI chips. But I think if you are sitting almost anywhere else, again, I'm speaking to you from Michigan, people here aren't celebrating the stock valuations of NVIDIA. They're saying, my goodness, the jobs shouldn't have moved south into the United States, and the other sorts of production shouldn't have moved to China. The elites certainly have this sense that, well, maybe it wasn't a good idea that we are now pretty dependent on China for something like rare earth magnets. When Beijing suspended exports of rare earth magnets.
All electric vehicles and weapon systems.
Which are pretty important, right? I think weapon systems are important. I think electric vehicles are important. And automakers immediately panicked when they couldn't get Chinese rare earth magnets. I think that we live in a material world. Maybe there are a lot of people who would like nothing better than to disappear into the computer and become an algorithm or something. And that's not the life you and I live, Christopher. That's not the life that most people live. I think we live in a physical world and we need to make stuff. And that's still pretty important.
So the knowledge that we've lost to build and to live in that physical world, that's process knowledge. What is process knowledge? What is it that we have lost, which goes beyond just the infrastructure to do all this manufacturing?
So I like to think of technology as three different things. So the first thing that technology is the tooling, the equipment. This is the really observable stuff. So in a kitchen analogy, this is the pots and pans, this is the stove, this is the spatula that we need to cook something. The second component of technology is written instruction. So these are things like patents and blueprints, all of the stuff that we're able to write down, like a recipe as well. And the third, I think the most important part of technology is something I call process knowledge. You can also refer to this as know-how. There's a Greek word, metis, to refer to this. You can talk about this as tacit knowledge. And I think this is the most important part of technology because a lot of things can't be written down and a lot of things can't be encoded as equipment. So if we're sticking with a kitchen analogy, let's think about giving someone who has never cooked a day in his life before the most wonderfully equipped kitchen and the most exquisitely detailed recipe. Can we expect that person to do something as simple as making scrambled eggs? Or maybe he'll make a big mess because he's never cooked anything before. And so it is a lot of this process knowledge that disappeared when American communities of engineering practice dissipated, when a lot of jobs moved away from where they were. And so one of these thought experiments I always wonder about is, let's say that Tim Cook and Steve Jobs decided that they weren't going to build these factories in Shenzhen. Let's just say, for the sake of fantasy, that they built all of these iPhone manufacturing hubs in Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania. One might well imagine that in the future, it's Pennsylvania that created all of these follow-on innovations around the smartphone. So maybe it could be the case that all of these battery technologies could be built in Pennsylvania. All of the screen and acoustics technologies, all of the consumer drones could still be in the US. But right now, it is Shenzhen that's making all of these pretty critical materials.
Let's turn back to China because the engineering state has its flaws. They're not just engineering, giant new water transportation infrastructure and high-speed rail and factories. They're also doing a lot of social engineering. What are the excesses of the engineering state?
For the most part, I think that the engineering state is really, really good once it builds a lot of infrastructure. You can certainly point to a lot of unprofitable bridges, unprofitable high-speed rail lines. But for the most part, I would say that it is really, really good to be building more mass transit, more trains, more subways, more bridges that connect people. And physical engineering, for the most part, is pretty good in spite of a lot of waste and a lot of profitability. And I think it would be excellent if the Chinese stopped themselves at physical engineering. But the problem, the fundamental problem with the engineering state, that they cannot restrain themselves. They cannot restrain themselves to be social engineers, and they cannot restrain themselves to be also population engineers as well. If we take a look at modern China, a lot of the human rights abuses are concentrated with ethno-religious minorities in Xinjiang, as well as Tibet. Even if you're in the Han majority, there has been all sorts of controls on your life, namely the hukou system, which is called household registration, which makes it really difficult for a migrant worker to move to a private city on the coast and have her child be educated in the schools. And I focus a lot in my book on the one-child policy as well as zero COVID. And the one-child policy, as I wrote, produced this sort of campaign of rural terror that really severely disrupted a lot of families in rural China that really relied on multiple children as their only guarantee of livelihood. I also lived through the zero COVID pandemic. And what zero COVID led to was Shanghai,
China's cosmopolitan dynamo, empty and silent,
being locked down for about 8 weeks, in which 25 million people could not step foot outside of their apartment compounds.
At night, the echoes of people crying out from their windows for help.
And so these are the sort of ways in which the physical engineers sort of treat the population as just another building material, as if it could be torn down and remolded as they wish. And that's really the sin of the engineering state.
Yeah, and there are ways in which the engineering state seems to get in its own way, even with respect to its stated goals of building things and economic dynamism And so, you have a great example in your book where you said, at one point she was asking where all of China's unicorns had gone, tech unicorns, right? How are these companies faring now? Is the engineering state kind of learning its lesson that there are these excesses to how it tries to control the economy?
I think one of the challenges is that the engineers can only engineer their way out of problems, even the ones that are created by engineering.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're referring to a meeting I wrote about when Xi Jinping was touring the province of Shandong. And at this economic symposium, he started asking, what happened to all of our unicorns? And some snarky people on the internet, whose comments were quickly censored, called Xi the unicorn hunter in chief, who didn't even really realize what he was doing. I think it's not unfair to say that Xi is not some sort of great economic thinker. This is not where his strengths lie. And he's sort of strangled and hunted down most of China's most wondrous beasts who were creating a lot of economic value that investors were getting really excited about. I don't think that China is really creating an excellent startup environment right now. They are doing some supportive policies on artificial intelligence. They're trying to help DeepSeek along. But I also am really reminded that the one-child policy started as an engineering exercise, in which the country decided that, we can just stop people from reproducing because it judged, I think incorrectly, that China had an exploding population. But now, how are they trying to get people to really have children again? Well, they're really deploying the tools of the engineering state once more. They're deploying party members. Many of these are people with too much time on their hands to harass women, younger families, asking women, when was your last period? Well, why don't you have another child? And so they're kind of hounding and harassing women to say, why don't you go have some children? And I don't think this is going to work. It is a lot more easy to block people from having children by sterilizing them or forcing abortions upon them than it is to encourage copulation.
Are the excesses of the engineering state in China, does that provide an opening for America to regain its footing in terms of the battle over, who is building the future with tech at the very least, or in any other areas?
I think one thing that is similar between the US and China are that they are both delivering all of these self-humiliations on a daily basis that are beating themselves up as quickly as they can. And I think the game is going to go to the country that just manages to stop beating itself up all the time.
So the least bad policy making.
That's right. Stop spanking yourself, I think would be a great policy. I think that Xi Jinping has been this remarkable unicorn hunter. I'm not sure that Donald Trump is being a great unicorn breeder right now. If we're thinking about all of these manufacturing problems that we've noted earlier in the conversation, I'm not really sure that the Trump administration is delivering anything of a manufacturing renaissance. I think the tariffs are on net pretty bad for American manufacturing. If we take a look at manufacturing employment since April, since Liberation Day, we'll see that the US has lost about 40,000 jobs since Liberation Day in manufacturing alone. And so that isn't promising any sort of a great renaissance. I struggle to think that the US can stay a scientific leader by depriving the scientific agencies of a lot of funding. So I think the estimates out there are that the National Science Foundation and the NIH have about half of their funding cut by the Trump administration. I think there is something real to the Trump deregulatory agenda. I think that might well be quite positive. But I think on net, the Trump administration is producing many more headwinds than tailwinds for achieving some sort of a technological renaissance in the US.
So what can the US do better? How can the US be more of an engineering state without becoming a social engineering state?
I want to start with the simple stuff. So there are so many of these headlines that San Francisco wasn't able to build a public toilet very well. It cost something like $1.3 million to build.
1.7 million was the estimate.
This is video of it arriving at Noe Valley's town square. It's a prefabricated unit with a project cost of about $1.7 million.
It came in well below that only because a construction firm volunteered its services.
volunteered. This is strange. We don't need the volunteering. We just need to pay these contractors to do a good job, right? So I just want us to get the simple stuff right. Denmark, I just spent a month in Denmark, which has these superb subway stations. They're totally spotless. Their subways are completely automated. There's no driver that is actually driving these subway trains. Let's just get to Denmark. Let's just get to Denmark levels of construction costs. I am in favor of having a more robust state that does the things that states are supposed to do, which means guaranteeing public order in big cities, which means building housing for people to move, which means building mass transit so that people are able to have reasonable commutes and get to their jobs. And so in my final chapter called Learning to Love Engineers, I bring out the example of this very reviled urban planner named Robert Moses, who is famously the subject of Robert Caro's magnificent, monumental work, The Power Broker, Robert Moses and the Fall of New York. And this was a time when Robert Moses made these horrible mistakes that displaced far too many people, that arrogated the interpretation of the public interest to himself, but was also a urban planner that built a lot of needed infrastructure, things like the Lincoln Center, things like the Flushing Meadows Park, to have these sort of wonderful infrastructure that many people are still using today in terms of highways, bridges, the opera. All of these things are pretty positive. And I want us to get back into a muscular government that is able to do the things that it says it wants to do, rather than sort of this puny government that isn't really able to do almost anything at all because it just heavily restrains itself by being plodding and proceduralist and too lawyerly about doing everything.
You're definitely the first person I've heard ever say, we need more Robert Moses in the world. Importantly, of course, the other part of that story is Jane Jacobs, who prevented Robert Moses from turning, the East Village in New York City into a giant highway interchange, which would have, I think objectively been really terrible. It sounds like you feel like we lionized in the U.S. the Jane Jacobses at the expense of what the Robert Moseses were capable of.
I think we've gotten the balance quite badly wrong. I think Jane Jacobs was absolutely right to stop Robert Moses at the time that she stepped in to say, yeah, let's not turn Washington Square Park into yet another highway, which had been Moses's plan. And I think there has been a good corrective to Robert Moses' excesses. But I think we also need to rehabilitate a little bit the works of these engineers that did build a lot of necessary infrastructure, because what we lack right now is a lot of infrastructure. We lack the housing, we lack the mass transit, and this is to say nothing of the big infrastructure push that is going to be required to decarbonize our economy, by transitioning our economy to more solar, more wind, more transmission lines. These are all pretty land-intensive sources of production that needs to be connected by the lines. And so we need to figure out how to build a lot more today. What I really want to say is that I think the US should learn to be a little bit more engineering, let's say 10% more engineering, such that it is able to build subways and bus stations, not at absurd costs. And I think it would be really wonderful for China to be much more lawyerly, let's say 20% more lawyerly, so that the Chinese are able to feel like they have some sort of rights that are being protected, that they're not going to be censored, that they have the space in their own lives to pursue things that they want to do.
Obviously, now you have China and the US both getting in their own way. But what should everybody listening to this pay attention to in both countries to know who might be pulling ahead or who might have the upper hand in the various, contests over power that are playing out between the two?
So the major US strength is the artificial intelligence sector. As you point out, I'm at Hoover. I spend a lot of time in Silicon Valley, surrounded by a bunch of nerds who are trying to build God in a box. And that is a lot of fun to see what they're trying to come up with. So that is where the US still has, I think, a pretty credible lead as of this moment, artificial intelligence. And the US has this tremendous weakness in manufacturing. And I'm quite worried that the US and the West will just lack the industrial base in order to produce critical goods. Now, what was really striking to me was that President Trump backed down really quickly from his tariffs in the wake of Liberation Day. All it took was for Beijing to suspend the export of rare earth magnets, for automakers to panic, and for Trump to give a trade truce to Beijing. And what's really surprising to me, actually, is that rare earth magnets is not China's only tool. China has a lot of other tools in which it really dominates the supply. And so I would point out something like a lot of active pharmaceutical ingredients, especially antibiotics and ibuprofen. Imagine if we don't have any more ibuprofen or antibiotics tomorrow. I don't like it when any country is so dependent on an adversarial relationship in order to supply critical goods.
And to put a fine point on it, the reason any country should be worried about being dependent on an adversary is that if there is a genuine conflict between the two of them, that puts the U.S. in a really difficult place. Similarly, the U.S. has in the past put China in a really difficult place when they've blocked the export of certain goods.
Yes, that's right. And even if it's anything short of a major conflagration in the Pacific, you could imagine that one day that, well, he says, we don't like this Dan Wang character. He's been criticizing China excessively.
Yeah, your blog is blocked, and the PRC, we should say.
That's right. I'm not sure if I have always been in persona grata in China, but maybe they can still threaten people and places and particular policies short of a really obvious big conflict. And so I think what the U.S. should do is to take this future a little bit more seriously, as the Chinese have, to say, well, if we actually want some degree of sovereignty, how are we going to actually achieve it?
Dan Wang, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Thanks, Christopher. This was a lot of fun.
We reached out to the California High-Speed Rail Authority. A spokesperson said that while the Central Valley Line is a critical part of the statewide Phase 1 high-speed rail system from San Francisco to Los Angeles, last month's report to the state legislature, quote, provides a clear path forward to connect the high-speed rail system to Northern and Southern California via the Central Valley by 2039. He also said that China's high-speed rail, quote, benefits from state control, low land acquisition cost, and high population density, whereas California's has had time and cost increases due to factors such as environmental, local needs, and legislative complexity. We also reached out to Tesla, which did not respond to a request for comment. We reached out to the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C. A spokesperson disagreed with Dan Wang's characterization of China's treatment of people in Xinjiang and Tibet. The spokesperson also said that the Chinese economy has a, quote, solid foundation for stable development and ample momentum to forge ahead. We also reached out to the White House. The spokesman said that President Trump's policies have yielded, quote, trillions in historic investment commitments in American manufacturing. He also said that the administration is, quote, cementing America's dominance, end quote, in cutting-edge technologies.